Greetings, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming to our talk. And for some reason, my Word file just disappeared from my thing. So hold on one second while I pull that back open. Um, sorry, just one second. Greetings. Sorry, like when a Word file disappears and that's your script. Greetings. Welcome to Mobilizing Sovereign Movements, Native Territories, Artistic Interventions, and Electoral Power. This afternoon is our third and final post-election dialogue in the series. Those who have watched the previous two dialogues, it's been great to have you return. And if you haven't, those exist on the American Indian Community House's social media pages. So they're on Facebook, they're on YouTube, and they're on Instagram. So feel free to look for those because those powerful dialogues as well that not only were timely in the moment, but are very much related to this larger historical moment, not just the election, and I think bring together very powerful Native womanist and Native Two-Spirit, queer, and trans voices. We also just want to encourage everyone watching now today to let your friends and loved ones, family members, and beloved communities know about the dialogue and the larger series. This is going to be going on the dialogue for the next 2 hours, and we encourage additional audience members. And if for some reason someone can't make it, this will also be recorded and on our social media within the next day or so. We have found that the more people who are encouraged to engage the election, both during it and then reflecting on it for future mobilizing, are mostly motivated by the people who are closest to them. And so hopefully this will be some beautiful connections for everyone. I'm gonna start off by reading the description for the series. Mobilizing Sovereign Movements, Native Treaties, Artistic Interventions, and Electoral Power is a diverse dialogue series with Indigenous womanist and Two-Spirit, queer, and trans Indigenous leaders in Oklahoma and New York, and across Turtle Island and the Pacific, engaging each other and our communities about intersections of Native sovereignty, gender, sexuality, the arts, and mobilizing electoral politics. Occurring over 3 distinct interlinked dialogues, the series is co-sponsored by the American Indian Community House in New York and Tulsa Artist Fellowship in Oklahoma. The series examines ongoing challenges faced by tribal nations and Native peoples in the wake of the McGirt v. Oklahoma decision and interwoven legal issues, such as the ongoing renewal of the intersectional provisions of the Violence Against Women Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, American Indian Religious Freedom Act, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and Voting Rights Act, as well as the 2020 US Census and election, as they affect issues of sovereignty, violence, gender, sexuality, civil liberties, freedom of expression and assembly, representation, and human rights. The dialogue participants are Indigenous womanist and Two-Spirit, queer, and trans Indigenous leaders in the arts, education, law, health, media, and environmental and social justice organizing. My name is Ahimsa Timoteo Barón, and I'm the organizer and moderator of the series. This project was created with the support of Tulsa Artist Fellowship and the American Community House. Created by the George Kaiser Family Foundation, Tulsa Artist Fellowship supports both local and national artists while enriching the Tulsa community. The American Indian Community House, AICH, is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization serving the needs of Native Americans residing in New York City. AICH was founded in 1969 by Native American volunteers as a community-based organization, mandated to improve the status of Native Americans and to foster intercultural understanding. Next, I'll be reading the Tulsa Artist Fellowship Land Acknowledgement. I'm a Tulsa Artist Fellow here in Tulsa, and at each of the Tulsa Artist Fellowship events, we begin with a reading of this land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contribute their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life. Some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted, and some fled Tulsa, never to return. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are standing on the tribal lands of the Osage, Cherokee, and Muskogee Creek people. We honor their elders past and present. We are standing on the land of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. We pay respect to these victims and survivors, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement upon this land. Tulsa Artist Fellowship offers our care and commitment to acknowledging these truths and resisting injustice in all forms through intentional programming and artistic practices. We started off the series with some really powerful speakers. On the first night, that was Lydia Cheshawala, Tara Moses, Molly Murphy Adams, and Aubrey Zode'en Ake'en Skeeter. And then for our second dialogue, we also had Ozawa Benishi Albert, Shawi Olale Glenda Stillingham, Jenny Keller, and Jaisha Lyons Echohawk. And tonight, we have a very distinguished group of folk, and I'll be introducing them. The format for tonight is we're going to be beginning with a dialogue internal to the panel. And then from there, we'll also open it up to questions later on. So if you're on Facebook and want to ask any questions, you can feel free to do that throughout the discussion. And then we'll see what we have time for later on. And we might bring some of those questions together if there's multiple questions and make them into some composite questions. So let me introduce our panel for tonight. Tani Atonharjo Growing Thunder is Kiowa, Muskogee, and Seminole, and a beadwork artist, regalia maker, curator, and museum professional. Vince Crisosimo, who will be joining us later tonight, is Chamorro and is a Pacific Islander, elders, HIV/AIDS, and LGBTQ community organizer and educator. Kristen Gentry is Choctaw Nation, a bisexual Native Womanx artist, writer, and curator. Alison Herrera is Holon Salinan, a radio, KOSU, and print journalist. Beverly Little Thunder is Standing Rock Lakota Nation, a two-spirit activist, organizer, writer, and educator. D. Keali'i Mackenzie is Kanaka Maoli, an Indigenous librarian-trained poet and proponent of queer well-being. And we also have Joseph M. Pierce, who is Cherokee Nation, a writer, scholar, and curator. So I'm really honored to be here with you all. And we had a set of questions that rather than read them verbatim, since I've already discussed them with people, I'm going to briefly summarize them because we have a lot going on today. The first question was basically asking the panel to introduce themselves and to talk a little bit about the work they do in the world and how that work has shifted over the past year. And one of our speakers today is Alison Herrera, who's a journalist and is going to be running out at a certain point later to cover a lot of the late breaking news and these larger stories. So Alison, would you maybe start us off today with introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your work and what you've been doing?
Sure. Hi, it's really great to meet everybody here. Thank you, Ahimsa, for inviting me to this really vibrant panel and your series, the series sponsored by the Tulsa Artist Fellowship. So I am a reporter. I cover Indigenous affairs for the state of Oklahoma for KOSU, which is the state's NPR affiliate. We have a signal in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and in Stillwater. I often say that my job is like drinking from a fire hose because there's just so much news going on in the state of Oklahoma with regards to Indigenous affairs. I was brought on earlier this year because I had previously done reporting in Oklahoma 5 years ago for a special project that I did where I was a producer paired with KOSU to do a special reporting project on Indigenous affairs. And so my project was only 9 months. And then after that time, the station and I have just been in contact about raising more funds to install me permanently in that position. I will say that KOSU is not unique in having a reporter that is dedicated to covering Indigenous affairs. I think there are 25 other news stations, both in print and radio and multimedia that also cover Indigenous affairs. There's two of my colleagues, Shondine Silversmith and my cousin, Deborah Kroll, cover Indigenous affairs for the Arizona Republic. Nick Martin, who is Saponi, he covers Indigenous affairs for the New Republic. There's High Country News, which has an Indigenous affairs desk. My colleague Savannah Meyer covers Indigenous affairs for Wyoming Public Radio. So I think, I have seen in the last 5 years, 5 to 10 years, a growing number of mainstream news outlets decide that they are going to make the commitment to having a reporter that covers that covers Indigenous affairs because the audience has demanded that, and that is an important part. They have said that is an important part of their listenership. So my job, as I have described it to people, is to report on the state's, what is happening in the state from an Indigenous perspective, but also, come at it from make it so that non-Indigenous and Indigenous audiences can understand what the news is. And so, of course, in the last 6 months in Oklahoma, there's been numerous things that have been decided. The gaming compacts has been one big decision that has impacted Native communities there. And then, of course, the McGirt decision. I covered that the day that the news broke and that the decision came down in the Supreme Court. And it was truly one of the most exciting reporting days of my career. I have to say, I talked with so many people that day who were just like today, just very emotional and very just were really excited and felt the historic moment of this of the McGirt decision and what it meant for tribal sovereignty and what it meant for decades of knowing what was already true, and that is that the Muskogee Creek Nation never had their reservation boundaries taken away or dissolved. And I think it's interesting, I talked with people outside of Oklahoma about that decision, and non-Indigenous people didn't quite understand what that meant. And they're like, well, when do they get their land back? And I had to explain, well, that's not exactly what the decision is about. The decision is about the ability for the tribe to be able to prosecute felony criminal, to be able to have the ability to prosecute felony crimes and not the state. And I think that is just as powerful. That's the tribe saying we are able to administer justice, not the state. And I think that there, as we have seen in the last 6 or 7 months, the state and the tribes in Oklahoma have definitely had a very fractious relationship. And so I think, and the reaction, I think, from the state has also proven that. You've seen Governor Stitt form this the sovereignty, protection, or the Commission on Cooperative Sovereignty, where not one Indigenous person is on that committee, and has made it a priority to administer legislation, to be able to fix any jurisdictional issues. So it's interesting to cover it because I think you see a lot of media outlets like the Tulsa World, the Oklahoman, who have really good reporters, but I notice in their coverage how they use the word fallout, or they cast the McGirt decision in this negative light that, talking about confusion, whereas I think my job is to talk about some of those jurisdictional issues that the tribe and the state may have, but I think again, this is where I come at it from. Coming at it from an Indigenous perspective, is that this is what the tribe is doing to make sure that no criminals are not prosecuted, or there people aren't falling through the cracks. So I did a story a couple of weeks ago about Muskogee Creek Nation's domestic violence program and how that program has been strengthened by the McGirt decision, and that people who work for their family violence prevention program have seen an uptick in the number of calls, not only because of the pandemic, but because of the McGirt decision. And that program serves not just Indigenous people, but they serve non-Indigenous people as well that need those services. And so I think the McGirt decision has strengthened their relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the handling of some of those cases. And I think so that's one story I just did recently. I'm actually about to do a story about Muskogee Creek Nation's. They really updated some of their criminal codes, like their traffic code, to be more compliant with what the state what the state has. And they also just updated their codes regarding use of medical marijuana. So I think those are really important developments on the part of the tribe to be able that they say, okay, we recognize this is a big, having, reclaiming our jurisdiction is a really big deal. It's really important to us. And this is what we are going to do to secure, to make people feel like, yes, we can handle prosecuting criminals and prosecuting non-felony crimes. And so I think that's the perspective that I come at it from. And I just don't, I mean, of course, I'm going to look at, people who are, I don't want to, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that, there are some people that are going to be prosecuted on the federal side. Those cases are really important to cover. And one thing, this was I listened to this really important panel with Sarah Deer, who is a Muskogee Creek citizen. She's an expert in tribal law. She's a professor of gender and sexuality studies at the University of Kansas, and Stacy Leeds, who is now district court judge for the Muskogee Creek Nation, and Jonodev Chaudhary, who is Muskogee Creek Nation's ambassador to Washington. And Sarah Deer said to me, she was like, well, people have asked me, why did I file an amicus brief in this case for a person who was convicted of sexual assault? And then I'm talking about Jim C. McGirt. And she said, when I asked her that question, she said, I didn't look at it as filing an amicus brief for the perpetrator. I filed this amicus brief on behalf of protecting victims. And I think what she meant by that is that by supporting a win in the McGirt case, she was supporting victims of domestic violence, people who and supporting the tribe's commitment to the Violence Against Women Act. So I think that's the way I look at that law, the way that I look at this decision. And certainly, with the gaming compacts, I think, tribes in the state of Oklahoma are, without the tribes, I think Oklahoma's economy would be not what I think that they're an important part of Oklahoma's economy. I think they're like the second most economic contributor in the state. They create jobs for Native and non-Native people. Yeah, just covering those things it's been an honor, and it's been an honor because I feel like I always feel like held to account as a reporter, but I know that people from the tribes, people in the community are listening to what I am saying. And I feel an intense sense of responsibility to that, and also elected public officials. So, and I guess I didn't really answer your question about how my work has changed. Reporting is about connecting with people. It's about engagement. It's not about attending press conferences all the time. It's about really trying to hear how people are reacting to this. And I feel fortunate I feel fortunate that I have a lot of those connections in the state of Oklahoma. I'm not from there, but I had spent a lot of time in these last 5 years, even after my first initial reporting project ended, going back there because I had made friends and I had made, I had forged relationships, and it's an incredible state to report from. People are just really, they really want to talk. They really want to open up. They really want to talk to you, and they really want to tell you how they feel. So I don't know if my job has necessarily changed since it's just become a little bit more challenging. And especially being a reporter, I have to rely more on phone tape, which I don't like. But and since this election is, we're talking about this historic moment, I do want to say that we have more Indigenous candidates that have been elected to office than in the history of this country. And I just learned this the other day. One of the first vice presidents was last name was Curtis, and he was Kaw. So that was an interesting thing I learned the other day. So we're in this really historic moment where we have the first African American, the first Indian woman elected as the vice presidency, but we also have a historic number of Indigenous candidates that have gone to office: 3 Republican, 3 Democrat. I think 3 men and 3 women. So that's, I mean, that is a really exciting thing for people in Oklahoma. It's an exciting thing for Indigenous communities all over, and it's exciting as a reporter to cover that. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Alice. Really appreciate you being here, and blessings with your work. Who would like to go
Thank
next and
you.
talk a little bit about their work and some of the shifts this year? Um,
I can go. I think that, you know, what Allison is saying makes a lot of sense in terms of connecting big picture issues to local communities. And I think that is something that I've been thinking about a lot today, as we've seen all of the major news outlets call the election for Joe Biden. And that is the result of local organizing, not the Democratic Party. That's the result of Black and Brown organizing and Native organizing in specific communities that have been able to turn out county participation in Detroit, in Atlanta, in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, among, you know, Navajo and Hopi communities and all of the different, you know, Native communities in Arizona. And so what we're seeing is, like, I think that this connection between the broader scale and grassroots organizing has been laid bare. And I hope that people are able to see that this moment requires greater investment in grassroots organizing rather than this sort of big picture, like Democratic Party sort of thing, right? Like the victories have not come because of the Democratic Party. They've come because of grassroots organizing. And so I think that's crucial reporting to do. I think that that's crucial, like intellectually and like relationally to make those connections. And I think that for me, you know, that's kind of been something that I've been kind of, it's just something I've been thinking about a lot. And I mean, my work as an academic, right, and as a writer has a lot to do with thinking about scales, about the scale of settler colonialism, about the scale of history and its effects on our communities. And the answer is always in relationships. It's always been about being a good relative. It's always been about, you know, as Leanne Simpson says, like, as we have always done. It's always been about that. And so I think we see that even in the election, right? It's like the ways in which Native communities are able to carry on the types of relationship building that have always been at the core of so many of our communities has been really important. And so that's what I've been thinking about a lot. You know, my work, like as a professor, as a writer, hasn't really changed in like the way that like I'm still like sort of yelling at people about colonialism all day, right? Like that's like basically what my job is. But but like I'm doing it in front of a screen rather than in front of a class. So like the format has shifted for me, and I've been doing a little bit more work internationally. I was just in a performing a really beautiful piece with a dear kin of mine, S.J. Norman. That was part of the Performance Space Sydney Live Works Festival. So we were performing love letters to each other that we read between New York and Sydney. As a part of like a two-spirit or queer Indigenous practice of kin making and care. And so that's the type of thing that I think is an example of bringing what we have been doing like for millennia to the current moment, which is enacting care and reciprocity among ourselves and with other people. And I think that's been crucial to me and my survivance over the past several months.
I just, Joseph, you just pointed out something really important that I forgot to mention, and that is the organizing efforts on the part of Indigenous people in Oklahoma. I mean, I remember about a month and a half ago going to an event, and there was a, get out the native vote. And with the DJ and people, handing out stickers and selling masks and stuff. And Jaysha Lyons Echohawk, who you had on one of your previous, she was in a story that I did earlier last week, and then I'm actually doing another story this week about the something else, so, and just talking to people about, I think it's important to note that, when my grandmother was born, she wasn't even a citizen. And the fact that Native people didn't even have the right to vote until much later, even though, and now the fact that they have been able, that the organizing efforts on the part of people in Arizona and in Nevada have flipped those states, I think is something, Joseph, like you said, it's not because of Democrats, it's because of people's grassroots efforts. And my colleague Shundeen Silversmith, she is amazing. Her and Deb Kroll did stories in Arizona, and they drove to all of these communities in Navajo and Hopi and did all of this reporting on Indigenous organizers and Native voting there. And we talk about voters. I was talking to somebody yesterday about some of the reasons why Indigenous people have been discounted, and also the distrust that Indigenous people have in the electoral system as a whole, but even still, showed up and voted and really turned out to vote in this election, I think is a testament to people like Jaysha, people like, Crystal Echohawk, and, no matter who you voted for, just the fact, that you put your faith in this system that has systematically denied, citizenship, violated treaty rights, I think is a testament to the work that people have done. It's pretty amazing.
I'll kind of go a little bit after Allison. In your intro, you talked about, as your reporter, I do writing, but not like as a reporter per se, but more as like a storyteller. And so I'm a fine artist. I'm a painter, printmaker. I do jewelry. I do all of that. And I grew up in Tulsa, and I grew up with the larger like museum world, galleries, art shows, festivals. And even now, I can still stand in a gallery and maybe be the only person of color. It's like my career tends to be Caucasian male dominated, and you can see that across, museum curatorial, like, everywhere within my career. So as a writer, I write for the Oklahoma Visual Arts Coalition, their Art Focus magazine. And like we get like options like what we want to write for, and we have so many Native artists clearly in Oklahoma. We always have art exhibitions, so I always want to do those stories. And when I sit down and write and talk and interview with our Native artists, I feel like I don't know, like our voice needs to be told through Native voice. Not that we can't be interviewed and written about through non-Natives, but just the connection, like how we talked about that kinship that comes through. And I'm trying to think all the words. Like, and then that experience as we're communing, and then getting way off topic because we're talking and laughing and all the joking and everything that comes with that. So that kind of was like a mix of my intro and relating to both of you, and like it's funny you guys mentioned Jaysha because I work with Jaysha as well, and I did with the new mural with that Taft did with I'm losing names right now. I'm sorry, I'm nervous. So I did that as an artist, and I was there with that, and just seeing all the people, and I even commented I was so like excited for how many people that are actually voting, just like you guys are talking about, like whether or not, you know, irregardless of like who they have voted for, just the fact of voting. Like even I had like family members that had never registered to vote, and this was their first time voting. So that was really exciting to me. So I can tell a little bit about more about me. Let's see. I have a daughter. This is my first event also that I've ever like openly been like I'm a bisexual woman. I I do a lot of work as a curator, trying to create spaces for our Two-Spirit artists, our LGBTQI exploring Two-Spirited. Received my master's degree this year in Native American leadership, and I did a lot of research into Southeastern culture specifically. And I've been really looking at how my specific culture in my area before and after removal, like how we lived in that Two-Spirit, how we all embody that masculine and feminine, and then not masculine or feminine at all, like just that gender binary, like what that actually means for each of our tribes. And it varies from tribe to tribe. I try to explain that to people, and it varies from person to person within that tribe. And that we continually shift, and our art will never look like exactly what it did, you know, like 300 years ago. Like our art will forever be evolving, and art doesn't have to look native, just as we don't have to look native. Those are all issues that I work with in my art. My husband is Cherokee, but he is very fair skinned. And so my daughter is much lighter skinned. And I get comments all the time, like especially when she was first born, because I don't take babies outside a whole lot right at first. And like people would ask me, like I like directly ask me, like, why is your daughter so white? And just that struggle. And you know, my husband would talk about experiences as a child where he would be like at a powwow, for example, and you know, that lateral racism of him, you know, the other children being like, well, you're not even native because he's not dark enough. And then when you grow up without that culture and without that language, I've even come across people that are like 100% fluent, full blood quantum. Blood quantum's a totally another issue. But that we like that is what I work towards, like dispelling those prejudices that, you know, that like all of us here, this is what Native looks like. And it's not a skin color. So that's what I work for in all of my art, and creating spaces for those people that may have transitioned already and now they're not welcome back in their stomp grounds anymore. When you look culturally, that would have never happened, you know, hundreds of like pre-colonization, because there were places for all of us. Our culture's created place is everyone has a place. Everyone has a role, multiple roles. And so trying to get back to those ideas, that's I felt kind of missing in the art world and in our Native cultures. Like, how do we keep those spaces, bring them back, and like get rid of some of that so that we can welcome everybody back, so that people can relearn their cultures that have went away, and that they don't have to know their language today, but what can they do to learn it now? What can they do to learn? Like, let us teach them. Let's not scold them. Let's not laugh at them, you know. Like if they've never been taught how to dance in the arena, for example, you know, teach them, you know, in their culture, find people that are willing to open their family up to that. That's all. It's hard to say that I'm just an artist, because that is like how I encompass all of it. As an artist, and I do writing, and like I said, for the magazine, and I also do I get to do writing within my artwork, and I've started working on writing my poetry into my artwork in Choctaw, as I'm relearning my culture, and I can teach my daughter our language through that. So I'm trying to include everything and trying to calm down. And so that's me. I don't know what else to say.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you so much, Joseph, and thank you so much, Alice. And these are beautiful, and the intersections and how people are weaving and interacting with each other is lovely. Who might want to go next? I think Beverly, I saw your hand earlier. Yeah.
Well, of course, you know, my name is Beverly Little Thunder, and I am from Standing Rock. I grew up part of my life on the reservation and part of my life in Los Angeles. I have spent most of my life as an activist. I can't count the number of marches that I've been on. I have 5 children. I got married, had 3 children, 3 marriages, and I made 3 men really, really unhappy. Because I knew that I was lesbian, but I didn't have the word for it. And I'm 73, and at the time, when in my 20s, I didn't know anybody else who was Two-Spirit. So a lot of the work that I have done since then is working with Two-Spirit people, and I found myself being rejected from the ceremonies that I had attended up until I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and told that women like me were taken out and shot. And 2 older women came up to me at different times while I was packing up my teepee and stuff and said, you know, if our people knew, if they knew their traditions, they would be so glad that you were here. And I heeded their words because they said, you need to go somewhere and do a ceremony for your own kind. And I had been having a strange dream about the Sundance. Now, I had danced, you know, in South Dakota for 13 years. And in my dream, it was totally different. The arbor was different. It was a living tree. All of the trees in the circle were living. And a year later, I decided that I needed to follow that dream. And so I did. I started doing a Sundance for, specifically for Two-Spirit women. Eventually included all women. And about 12 years ago, each year I presented something. We have a dancers council and we have a supporters council. And we meet each year and we talk before the ceremony and talk about how the last ceremony went and what we can do to improve it, if you would. And I kept bringing up the fact that in my culture, a Two-Spirit person was not necessarily presenting as a woman. And there was some pushback at first. And so the next year I brought it up again. And they finally, everyone agreed that it was time to open up to Two-Spirit people, non-binary people. And I felt such a sense of relief because during this journey, I realized that tradition, the word tradition, is something that boxes us in. I was asked if I do a traditional sweat lodge, and I said no, because everyone who comes to the sweat lodge drives there. They come in their car. They don't come on horseback. They don't walk miles to get there. We don't cover our lodge with deer hides. We use blankets and canvas. We don't start bring our rocks in on a forked stick. We bring them in with a pitchfork. And almost everybody wears something. They wear clothing, you know, shorts and a t-shirt or a wrap. They wear something when they go in the lodge, and traditionally, I don't think they did. but the prayers are just as strong. And so my life has kind of been guided by spirit. I really listen. And I oftentimes say that when I am faced with a decision, if it's something that is going to benefit me, then I know it's my ego speaking. If it's something that's going to benefit the whole, then it's spirit speaking. And I lean toward whatever spirit tells me to do. And, I've been called crazy. I've been called all kinds of things, criticized by some of my own people, asking, how dare you do that? And I think to myself, how dare I pray? How dare I reach out and accept human beings? I live in a state where the tribes have just gotten state recognition, the Abenaki. And it took them a long time to get that because of their history. And I am privileged. I am privileged. I look like a stereotypical Native person. Most people know immediately. I have the dubious honor of having a card with a number on it, with a pedigree, saying who I am. That doesn't make me any more Indigenous than my blonde sister who has blue eyes and whose father was Indigenous. I have 3 granddaughters who are actually more Indigenous than their mother, if you want to look at blood quantum, because she is half Lakota, and she married a man who was Maidu from California. So her children are Maidu and Lakota. And if you do the math, those girls are more Indigenous than their own mother, which I find kind of funny. But those girls are very light complected and have, very light hair. And people say, oh, you're Native? Oh, you don't look Native. And so I have to spend a lot of time with them talking about, this lateral violence that we impose upon one another. And a lot of my work, I sit on the Commission for Native American Affairs in Vermont, is helping get bills passed to help the Abenaki become more visible, because they have stayed in the background for so long. We got Columbus Day abolished and Indigenous Peoples Day instituted. We have a whole week in May that is state recognized as Indigenous Culture Week. We recently got a bill passed that enables all of the citizens of the Abenaki tribes to fish and hunt for free. And we also got a bill passed that will allow us to go to all the state parks and have signage that states what the Abenaki called that place and why they called it that place. So that'll be in addition to, like, if the pond, it's called Big Pond, there'll be something underneath it in Abenaki that talks about it. And, those are big steps for a tribe who has not been recognized in many ways. And, as a Lakota, I am not in my own territory. And so I spend a lot of my time learning and listening. And in the last few years, and especially in this last year with this, this COVID thing, I've learned how to use Zoom. And I've also recognized that at my age, my role has shifted, and I've had to adjust to being older. I think I've said once to someone that from here up, I'm 18. And from here down, I'm every bit of 73. And that's a hard place to kind of fit in, and feel comfortable, with myself. But I feel like the younger people that are coming up are showing up. And, with the election, I saw all of these young people out there trying to encourage people to vote. And we had the largest turnout we've ever had in our state this year. In the town I live in, there are 1,800 people. We had 1,600 vote. It's the highest number in this little town. And part of my role in that was to encourage these young people who were trying to do work, even if what they were doing is not something that I would do. I still encourage them to do it. I still want them to feel that their voices matter, their ideas matter. And I recognize that as they get older, things may change. They may have a different perspective. But I don't want to squash that. I don't want to tell them, well, no, that you shouldn't do that. That's not the way it was done. Because that to me is a punitive statement. That to me is borderlining violence. And I believe that we're in a time when we need to encourage one another. We need to pay attention to our language, to the tone of voice we use. And we need to lead with love. And we need to remember that judgment came when Western civilization came and took over. Judgment came when the missionary said, no, don't do that. That's bad. Oh, you should not have a child who loves another boy, or a girl who loves another girl. Oh no. God doesn't want that. And I always wondered, how do they know what God wants? Because they're reading a book? And it's like tradition. I don't know anybody who's 300 years old who can tell me how things were done. But what I do know is that what comes from our hearts, if we do what comes from our gut, and we do it for our people, and when we say our people, we mean everybody. We mean everybody. There are Europeans who live here in this country and who look every bit Caucasian, who are descendants of indigenous people in Europe. There were indigenous people in Europe, a lot further back than many of our tribes go, but they still were indigenous. And so they have a struggle within themselves. And I try to encourage younger people to write about their experience as an Indigenous person now. Don't be the person that an anthropologist writes about 50 years from now. Put it in your own words. Write your own stories. Because that's where a lot of people get their impressions of who we are and what we've done in the world. And up until maybe 25 years ago, most of the stories were written by white men. And they totally ignored women. And, you know, my grandmothers have said that this is the time for women to step forward. This is the time that women need to take their rightful place. And I had one grandmother say, and no offense to anyone who identifies as male, that every man who's on this planet entered this world through a woman's vagina. And it's the truth. And so we need to work together. You know, I believe that little boys need to be embraced. They need to be loved. They need to be guided. If we want them to grow up to be adults that do good for the world. You know, we're the only species on the planet that become so self-centered. We forget about the whole. And our people prior to occupation thought about the whole. They thought about caring for one another. And we've lost that. I see it when I go back home, and it makes me really sad. I see it here in this state, and it just breaks my heart. You know, and I see the fractions that happen between people. We need to learn nonviolent communication with each other. We need to learn how to mediate between two people who disagree. Because we all are more alike than we are different. And we all just want to see a world that's peaceful and is safe for everyone. So, you know, I've been an activist since I was in my teens. I think I'm still an activist. I was a nurse for 42 years, now retired. I also believe in food sovereignty, and that, you know, it's important for us to learn how to grow our own food and how to save our own seeds. That's something that I feel like, you know, we've lost. And I've had women and men come to the house and taught them how to preserve their food, how to can it or how to dry it. So I do a lot of different things, and I don't do it for myself. I do it for those generations, those 7 generations coming, just like the 7 generations that have passed did for me. And so I'm really grateful to be a part of this discussion, and beyond excited that we have someone else in office right now. And I just wish I could have been a fly on the wall to see the look on Cheeto's face. I know that's mean, but it's how I felt. And I can't say that I love Biden and I think he's going to do a great job. But I do think that Kamala being vice president is going to have a huge impact. I think we're going to see a vice president that um, is going to be more in the forefront than any vice president we've ever had. Um, you know, I'm ready for change. I'm ready for change. And this pandemic that, is going on has affected, Native communities in a big way. And you hear so little about it. And I'm hopeful that something will change so that our people will also pay heed to what this virus can do. We don't know the full extent of it. Um, and for me, it's taught me that I can be a homebody. I don't have to go anywhere. I get to stay home and bead and sew and uh, play in my garden. Like this morning, I planted 75 daffodil and tulip bulbs, and really, really, really happy right now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Beverly. That was beautiful. And it's just covered so much. Thank you.
Um, Hello, everyone. My name is Kaylee Mackenzie.
Can you just speak up a bit, Kaylee, so we can hear you better?
Oh, yes. Just wanted to say aloha mai kako to everyone. My name is Kaylee Mackenzie. I'm coming to you from the traditional land district, or Ahupua, of Kailua, beneath the mountain of Olomana, on the island of Oahu, in the occupied nation of Hawaii, within the boundaries of the United States. I want to thank everyone who's spoken so far. Look forward to hearing others speak afterwards. Beverly, I wanted to say that I originally grew up in Massachusetts, in one of the traditional homelands of the Agawam and Pecumtuck peoples. I lived in Worcester, Massachusetts, Nipmuc country, and I was visiting last year where my family lives in Springfield. And I met with a friend who was native who had been to one of your dances and lodges, and she gave me some sacred tobacco from your two-spirit gathering. And I brought that back home with me to Hawaii. And when I went to Mauna Kea for the action that was happening there, I brought that with me there as well and keep it with me for protection and sort of the good spirit and energy that comes with that. So I like that there's that connection here. And I want to say mahalo for the work that you do doing that. So coming from Hawaii, it's been interesting to see everything that's been going on in the larger, like, national, international zeitgeist. I woke up to frantic text messages from family and friends about the election results. So it's been good to see that. I will say that my work, which is primarily creatively as a poet, has been shifting over the last year as I become sort of reflexive about myself and what I've been doing personally. And as I do that, I find myself writing about sort of things related to the pandemic or ongoing issues of social justice for Black lives, for Native lives. And so that shift happens gradually over time. And I just sort of go with the flow on that to see what comes up. In my work every day, I work broadly in healthcare. I work for the local Blue Cross and Blue Shield, which I recognize can be problematic. But a lot of the work I do within that, it does focus around transgender, non-binary, queer health, and trying to make policy and health insurance more accessible, reducing barriers to access, and really finding ways to get rid of sort of institutional silence around queer health. Um, so that's been a big thing. And I'm hopeful that with a Biden-Harris administration, we will not see cuts to programs like Medicaid, which, because of the global pandemic, we've seen, record numbers of people have to utilize for health insurance and access to health care, particularly in Hawaii. I believe it's somewhere about half or more of transgender folks use Medicaid to get gender affirming care. So knowing that we have an administration that at the moment looks like, hey, they're not going to cut that we can maybe increase access provides some sense of relief while we kind of look at ways to improve overall health and well-being for community. Um, in terms of some of the other issues that have been impacting Native America, well, I would say Indigenous America. Um, I've been following the McGirt case for a while, particularly with the podcast This Land, for those who might be familiar with that. Because what I've noticed is that there's often what impacts one Native community can just have such broad implications. And for Hawaiians, our relationship to the United States is quite different. But, you know, when we have to go before state or district courts, things like that, sometimes we have to go to the Supreme Court, what we find is that decisions made by non-natives often draw upon this larger corpus of work. So it's always important to sort of keep abreast of that in as many ways that we can. In terms of the future, um, you know, being Hawaiian means that we know that no matter who's in office, we struggle to continuously organize, continue to resist. And what I'm excited about is seeing so many people who have been energized by the current moment recognize that there's long-term planning coming down the road, that there's long-term work that we have to do. Here in Hawaii, Mauna Kea is still an issue. There's still a possibility of desecration on that sacred mountain. And there's lots of work to be done to prevent the construction of the 30-meter telescope on top of it, as well as look at other issues that infect Native Hawaiians as well as the larger community. And so much of it has to do with how we approach things such as military control of our islands and the ongoing sort of impetus with which the military operates in Hawaii and then radiates itself out into the rest of the Pacific and the world. So we continue to make connections with our kinship and our brothers and sisters within the rest of the Pacific, Native Pacific peoples, from Rapa Nui to Aotearoa to Fiji to Papua New Guinea, support the ongoing struggle for independence in West Papua. So there's all these other things that we look at to continually mobilize around. So I'll just end with that for now. So mahalo for sharing thoughts so far.
Thank you, Keali'i. Tani, would you like to go next there?
Sure, thank you. I am Tani Aton Harjo, Growing Thunder. I have a super long name, or some of you might know me from my web appearance as Curating Indigeneity. I'm a curator, but I'm also an artist. I'm a mother and spouse and daughter to artist. And it's been I'm middle-aged now, but I still feel like I'm in this being a child, but I know I'm stepping into a role as not so much a leader, but somebody who is having to take place. And that being because I was well prepared by my family members, by my mother, my grandparents, my great grandparents, and I am a third generation removed from agency lifestyle, being Kiowa, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole. But I'm enrolled Kiowa, I've been raised Kiowa. And we say that because my grandfather um, they were very late in their lives to have children. And my mother was very late in her life to have myself. And that being said, that I was raised with the real uh, traditional and original upbringing and belief that it wasn't too far of a divide from the way that our culture once lived. And so being posed as a modern person, sometimes it becomes very difficult working in the field as a museum professional. And I'm very thankful for the opportunities that I've had, that my family has paved the way for me. to be able to participate in American museums and across the network. But it's also provided me an ability to know how to serve, and that is in a governmental format and understanding the laws and policies, because we are indebted into our agency as a tribe. And it's very different because for us, we've been embattled. We're one of the tribes that are always embattled, among each other, among the government. And that is something that I think being embattled as a person, as a tribe, allows me to go forward and say, this is what we need. How are we going to get there? And so, not just as a parent or as an educator, but working in a field of the arts where a lot of times there's a divide. They don't realize that there's a relation to these objects in which we have, being related to. So I'm working directly with collections that are coming that were made by my great grandmother. That are, I've been in collections where I've seen my family's remains, where you see the bust of their creation of their face, because they were going to genome study. And I know not everybody is set up for that, but to work with NAGPRA and Section 106 and a lot of these terminologies in which we have, uh, among our Native nations, and the what we have to do to fight to gain access. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to the groups like Tulsa Arts Fellowship, where we have met and, joined together, and then also to the American Indian Community House, who's lent support to my mother's artist career, her art career, and also to mine, because coming from Oklahoma, uh, being in this community, it's very hard. Blood quantum does get in the way. I agree with Kristen. And, where they think they're helping us, they want to tout somebody as, oh, they're the only full blood Native curator among us. Well, that doesn't make it fair to the rest of us and our relatives that are out there. And you gain scrutiny because they think they're trying to help us, but they're really hurting us when we're coming from that traditional being of everybody being among one another and not holding that against each other. And so that's the issue that I've seen and faced, over the year. It's been a tough year. I'd have to say, uh, being in a state that lacks, opportunity for many of us. And as Kristen said, we're, um, our arts and culture and humanities is, bound to this code of, male Anglo PhD, um, statures, and many of us are just having to wait, or we have to seek opportunity elsewhere. And so that's really how I came involved with New York. They've been welcoming to me, and so I've been, uh, I divide my time between New York and Oklahoma, and that's where my work and my hopes, uh, tend to go. But I can tell you, as a Native person who survived H1N1 in 2009, which could have potentially been a very, drastic pandemic that was taken care of. Um, I survived that, but it was with impact to my health, to my child's health, who I was carrying at the time. And I can see that now, where we have many people who are going to face the struggles due to COVID-19 and what it's going to do to their health from here on. Because H1N1, I was just basically sent home to go recover on my own, or, um, ease my way into the loss of myself. And so, um, that has impacted my health by way of having autoimmune disease, and that came from the inflammation in my body of not being able to treat um, the fever that I had, and the fever that my fetus had, my infant had, and, having a reaction. My native body can't tolerate a lot of, new things, so new foods, new, medications. My body couldn't tolerate the medications in which they were taking. So that created the inflammation in my body, in which I live with now. So facing COVID-19, I live in fear. Not only fear of the loss of employment, because I've had to cancel my advisory. I've also been homebound on remote work because of the threat in which I face in a community that's not taking COVID very seriously. So today, um, waking to the news of the change that's going to happen, it was almost like a weighted blanket of relief was taken off of me as somebody who lives with a disability, who lives in fear of just what can happen, but also living in fear of this disease that's among them outside these windows. And so today is a monumental place, but I have to say that it's driven by the smile that my daughter gave me this morning when I walked into the living room. She was looking at the television, and I've not seen a bright smile on that child's face since probably March, as she was watching the news. So, and then the other part of that is seeing a result of watching Van Jones cry on CNN, and then also looking at the feed on Instagram and on social media of our friends and relatives in New York, and seeing the city celebrate and making the noise of celebration for the news for today. So today feels like it's a healing day of where we're going to move forward. And so with everything that I've experienced as a museum professional and as trying to serve our communities and bring arts and humanities and forefront of the culture that we need, today feels like a good day. Like we're going to turn that corner. And it's been very hard to defend our art and our culture over the past year and over the past 4 years, with National Park Service, NAGPRA, Bureau of Land Management. It's been a very hard fight for many of us who work in this field. So that's what I just wanted to share. But I want to say thank you to all of you for sharing. Beverly, it's quite an honor to hear you speak today. I'm a parent to Dakota and Nakota children, and raising them to know both their cultures, and they're bilingual. It's amazing to see that the language is still living for our children. And so that's where we are today. And, just know that that little smile on that face today gave me a sense of where we need to go. And so I want to say Mado and thank you to American Indian Community House, Tanis, and all of you for supporting us.
Thank you all so much. Really beautiful. Thank you, Tani. Similar to earlier, since I had mentioned in previous dialogues, these much longer, fully developed questions, I'm just going to briefly summarize them just for sake of time, because I really want to hear from the panelists. So what I'd originally asked in previous conversations for the previous two dialogues was just how much is at stake in the election. So I'm not going to go into what all that is. A lot of us are aware, but we all have different takes on that. And one of the things that might be at stake would, for example, be the future status of the US Supreme Court as one example. And there are, for example, 2 Senate seats in Georgia that are going to be going to runoff in January. And we don't know fully where Georgia will be in terms of the vote, but it's trending towards a Biden victory in Georgia, which would also count towards the electoral votes there for that as well, for the presidential election this year. And what I've been believing is, if Georgia comes through for us, we need to come through for Georgia. So like if Georgia has shown up in this very powerful grassroots mobilizing way, then we need to do what we can to support our loved ones in Georgia, get connected with someone who lives in Atlanta or somewhere else. There's various tribal communities, there's various communities of color, queer, trans communities, women's communities, diverse communities. Stacey Abrams and various other people have been doing amazing organizing work in the state. And there's various nonprofits that are committed to mobilization. And if we are going to be thinking about what are some next steps, that's just one example of what's the situation now as the votes are being tallied. And one of them is the election's not over. Like there's going to be some runoff elections, and 2 of them might determine the future of the Senate. And if we win those 2 Senate seats, that would bring it up to 50 seats. And then that would mean that Kamala Harris, as the vice president, would be the deciding vote in the Senate, because that's one of the roles that the vice president has. So just for us to be continuing thinking, yes, let's celebrate this weekend, and this week, start thinking about how can we support Georgia and connect with Georgian diverse communities to really start mobilizing as soon as possible for that January runoff elections. So yeah, I basically want to open it up to people, sort of what are your reflections now that we're seeing the results come in? There have been some tremendous victories. There have been also some things that we're hoping are still going to be victories. There's also maybe been some setbacks or folk that we were hoping would win certain electoral seats in either the House or the Senate or state legislatures or more local races. And there's various like legal intersections, such as the Violence Against Women Act and the various Indigenous, LGBT, and immigrant and migrant provisions thereof being renewed each year, and what those mean, as well as just so many other intersections in terms of religious and spiritual freedom, in terms of Native traditions, in terms of sovereignty across the board. We are very concerned around what might future Supreme Court cases be in terms of sovereignty with this court, as well as reproductive freedom, queer trans equality, so many different things, environmental issues. So I won't repeat the entire question, but I'd like to sort of get, y'all's take on what are some of your thoughts about this historic moment and moving forward in the coming months or coming years, whatever part of that you want to take on, not just politically, but it could also be a creative response, or how do you want to see communities taking care of themselves to sustain themselves, to keep on doing long-term mobilization work. And for those who are voting for the first time, maybe either young folk or other folk, how do we support people who this was their first election and or are being activated in a way in terms of the electoral process for the first time, and or how do we support that just beyond electoral as well? So any part that you want to take on, I'm down. Thank you so much.
I think that, you know, it is a time for celebration because someone's going to step into a role that might be somewhat, you know, better than what we've had to deal with the last 4 years. Might be a little clearer thinking, and you know, there's hope there. It's a hopeful, historic event that happened today. But it doesn't mean that everything's going to be fixed. And as a Native woman, the very best thing that I can do is to educate, to point out some of the discrepancies that, you know, Native people have had to endure. Right now, there's a high school about 75 miles from us, and they have a mascot, which is really offensive. And they can't understand why it would be offensive to Native people. And so that's happening, you know, all across the country. That awareness of those things that, you know, 20 years ago, or 30 years ago probably, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. I would just have accepted it. And, you know, as Native people, we were conditioned to just accept what was there, was given to us. And I think that going forward, it's important to not accept what is being given to us, but to move beyond that and to ask for what it is that we want. We have the right to do that. And whether it be through art, whether it be through music, whether it be through writing, or even just speaking, I think that any one of us who has even a little bit of awareness about social justice, or environmental justice. You know, so often I see these young kids coming together, having rallies and speak outs about you know, the environmental things that are going on. And I don't see a lot of Native voices there. Here, the chief of one of the tribes said, well, this land was stolen from us, and now you want us to speak out about protecting it after you've ruined it? Well, that may be true, but we still are living on the same planet. And, you know, in the environment, we are at a crisis stage. We're at a point of crisis in this world. And I want my great-grandchildren to have a place to be. I want them to have cleaner air. I want them to have, you know, clean water. You know, at this point in time, when you really stop and think about it, there is not fresh water that is pure anywhere on this planet. Because any body of water that's been rained into is bringing down all the chemicals that have been going up in the atmosphere. And so our waters are polluted in that way. But people don't think about it. And so it's important for, you know, the younger generations to be encouraged, to be nudged, to talk about those things. And I see that, you know, the government system was never set up for Native people. It was never established for us. You know, the Constitution was written by, you know, a group of white men who were rich white men, so they could keep their land holdings and their status. And when you start going back in history and you recognize what your family's place was in that and how unfair it was, then, you know, you should be angered enough to speak out. You know, Connie is talking about, you know, having children who are part Lakota and part Kiowa. And yet they're only allowed to be enrolled in one tribe. And so if they get a card that says that, you know, their blood quantum, you know, I never knew what part of me was, you know, are my arms different blood? You know, I think it's the same blood that goes through my whole body. But the card will say half Kiowa. And someone comes along and sees those children and says, oh, well, they're only part Indian, they're only part Kiowa. That's not true. They are full blood. They are full blood Native. Both parts of them are indigenous to this state, to this world. And those are things that, you know, I think we as nations really need to start looking at. How we have accepted that role of being, you know, stamped and labeled and pedigreed. Because that pedigree is what has started the ladder of violence between people. You know, I see it all the time on tribal councils. Someone will be appointed, you know, the head of the tribal council, and then you'll hear, oh, well, he's not full blood. He's, you know, he doesn't even speak his language. How can you speak a language that you've never heard before? Until I was 5 years old, I spoke fluent Lakota. Then I went to school. And it was that you need to speak English and you need to be articulate because you're going into a white world. You know, and my mother said, yes, you're Native, but don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. This is the early 50s. And I never understood why. You know, my mother and father, when they got married, on my mother's marriage certificate, she called American Indian and wrote Caucasian, wrote white above it. And there was a law that anyone who was white could not marry a person of color. And my father was raised in an orphanage and didn't know what tribe he was from, what his background was. And so he had just written white. They wouldn't allow him and my mother to get married until my mother wrote that she was white also. Now, and those are things that we need to, as an older person, I want to teach to younger people. I want to make them aware. I want to see children like Tani's children grow up to be non-judgmental, to be accepting of all parts of them. You know, there's a lot of, you know, we talk about Black Lives Matter. There are certain parts of this country that were refuges for Black people who ran away. There was a whole village in Florida that was Indigenous and Black people. They lived together, they worked together. None of us, not any of us, can control who our children grow up and fall in love with. We don't get to control what our grandchildren are going to look like. So we need to get over this, you know, this division. And moving forward, I think that once we stop separating ourselves from each other, I fully believe that we can craft a vehicle to move forward and to step into that arena of colonization and play by their rules and get some real change done. You know, and at the same time, I have to look at myself and see how much I have embraced colonization and realize that I'm guilty of doing and accepting a lot of things that colonization has imposed on me. So, you know, it starts with us, but then we need to spread it, you know, to our sisters and brothers and those that are coming up after us. You know, the children are my hope. I won't be here 25 years from now, but there'll be a whole new generation coming up, and I have faith that they're going to make some really, really incredible changes. You know, and the Two-Spirit people, non-binary people, trans people, we're all people. We all have blood running through us. And in the last 35 years, I've seen a tremendous change in that community. And it makes me smile. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beverly. Yeah, I would love to hear from others now.
I wanted to, can I, Beverly, I remember marching with you in New York at the Pride Parade a couple years ago. And that was an honor, and it's an honor to be on this panel here again. I live above a bar, and there have been people downstairs, and that's how I knew about that the race had been called for Biden, because people started yelling in the streets, and people have been banging pots and pans, and we've been banging pots and pans, and there's people, you know, still out in the streets, and all of the cars honking and everything. There's just been this hum all day of excitement. And so I'm also really distracted right now because I can hear this out the window, and it's actually really beautiful. But that's the energy of New York right now, you know, all over New York. This is happening. My partner left the apartment. He's not here right now because he wanted to go be with the people and be celebrating, right? And I think, you know, that's really wonderful. I also think there's many things that you've said, Beverly, that really resonated with me, and I want to just like briefly talk about two of them. One is that you know, the issues of kinship and how we define family have always been much more expansive than white people ever understood. And so it makes sense that we have that there has always been a place for two-spirit people, for differently gendered people, for people that are liminal in different ways. And because we've also always understood our relationships to extend beyond the human towards non-human relatives other than human relatives. And yet that is also that's one of the core things that colonization has sought to disrupt and break. And so assimilation and boarding schools are all about removing children from their families. And you know, Sarah Deer was mentioned earlier. Sarah Deer is an academic whose work is all about violence against women. Violence against Native women is also one of the core ways in which Native families are disrupted. And the thing that I would add to that you brought up for me, Beverly, is adoption. Adoption and the theft of our children is another way. And I think we need to start putting these things in connection. We need to take violence against women and two-spirit people, boarding schools, and adoption as three essentially interconnected parts of settler colonialism that have all sought to dismantle Native kinship structures. So my father was adopted by a white family, right? And I'm the second generation after that. So my authentic Native experience is always inflected by disruption, because my father was not raised in Cherokee community. That all of this happened later because my father was born in the early 50s, and his biological father was white, his mother's Cherokee, and it was like, that was a whole thing. She was my and so like that path is so winding and so difficult and so fraught, and yet settler colonialism has made that the path of so many people, thousands upon thousands of people, before the Indian Child Welfare Act and after, right? And so I also have to recognize that for me, and you talk about we need to tell our own stories, my authenticity is predicated on my ability to say that my experience is as a second generation child of an adoptee, that my path to this is just what it is. It's not more or less Indian than anyone else's path. And that in recognizing myself as part of this process of healing, connecting, becoming kin again, I realized that I was always part of that. I've always been part of these families, and no one has ever rejected me because my father was adopted and taken away from his family. No one has ever rejected in Oklahoma when we go, but when I was able to go to Oklahoma for the first time and meet my grandmother for the first time, no one ever rejected us. So the thing is that the healing part of that is also embedded within our traditions of knowing that that there's a place for all of us. And so it's so weird to me to be like, I live in New York, but I'm Cherokee, but like I never grew up in Oklahoma. All of my biological family is in Oklahoma, but I didn't really know them. And so like I have these weird connections with Oklahoma and then the McGirt stuff and all of it. It's like, it's very emotional. But I think that all of these things are connected, and that's not an accident. And that it is also in framing those connections as part of our resistance and our resilience that will also serve us well going forward. So I just want to say thank you again, Beverly, for being here with all of us. You're an inspiration for lots of us.
Someone like to go next? Thank you so much. Kristen, would love to hear from you. Tani, Kaylee.
Sure. I've just, we all keep talking about the kinship and the interconnectedness in that family. Because, like others have spoke about this, like, and I talked about it too, about that looking Native. And I guess I have that benefit or that privilege that I do look that way, that stereotype. And so sometimes I struggle when I'm trying to help other people, like that, like they don't even want people to know they're Native. Or like, how do I learn anything about, they'll come to me, they want to know just how do I even learn anything about my own family, my culture. And, when we talk about those things, and I kind of feel like, I guess because I have that, I'm trying to use that now to give them that space, to give others that space, because I don't know what to call it. Would privilege be a good word? You guys might know better terminology for this. But because I have that, like, I'm charged to do that. I feel like inside me, like, I need to make these spaces for people that don't have that opportunity, because I do. And I really learned my culture as an adult. For like my story, like my grandfather was adopted out, and like for his allotment land, and he had to be like, he's passed away. Both of my parents are also deceased. But like going through my parents' things, I found like his adoption papers, his like he had to get a new birth certificate when like he became an adult. He wanted his actual last name on his birth certificate. Didn't want that adopted name. Just going through all that paperwork, and I even like went through and saw like on my mom's paperwork, like all their paperwork when they had to get registered, got their CDIBs, because it was difficult to get that pedigree, that CDIB, even because of him being adopted into a white family, and therefore no records, with the Dawes rolls. And so, and I had no, like, I just grew up, I was Choctaw, I already had my CDIB, I had my tribal membership. And like, I don't think my mom, before she passed away, had ever talked about that whole journey. I didn't even see all of that work she did for me, and like her own dad, her siblings, all my cousins now, because my mom did all of that work. And, I would have loved now to have conversations with her and tell her thank you for what she did, because I don't know what, like these documents that hurt us and take things from us, I don't know what that's going to mean, the 7 generations. Like, will it one day matter? Like, because of how much blood quantum is interconnected and everything, will it matter one day? Like, will my great grandchildren even get to be Choctaw? Like, I don't know these things. And like, what can we do now within like who we elect for things at the state level? Like, how is this? And I see like the McGirt case now affecting my personal family, because I had family that were murdered in a car accident. And then 10 years ago, it's the Stephen Wade Jameson case in Oklahoma. And it's going back up again because the state is deciding if the guy was Cherokee at the time or not, because he didn't enroll until after, a year later. So to me, right there, this case that's going on right now, I mean, if the state gets to decide if the guy was Cherokee or not, to me that like eliminates our tribal sovereignty right there. The state shouldn't be deciding if this guy was Cherokee. I feel personally, that's up to the Cherokee Nation, his citizen. Like, other nations shouldn't get to decide your citizenship. So the McGirt case is, affecting this case. And then I feel like this case will then be affecting how other cases look at how people are decided to be tribal citizens. Because if the state is like, yeah, this guy was Cherokee, even though he didn't, I mean as a Cherokee citizen, I don't mean he wasn't Cherokee before citizenship. I just mean as a citizen, if he didn't have that, like, that will affect other court cases after that. And to me, again, that would just be another loss for our own, another way to erase us. And I know people are really strong and like making really funny things about us being called something else, which is great. That is our resiliency. We have humor that is amazing. We all have these great laughs, and it's like one of my favorite parts of our culture. But it also, just shows how like it didn't even cross the person's mind, whoever did that, intentional or not. Another way to erase our identities. It's just another form of genocide. And those things lead into VAWA. When we are dehumanized, it's easier to hurt us, kill us, take away everything. And we're constantly told, in the past, when you look at all the children that were adopted out and taken, like stolen children, that you're not a fit mother, or, murdered and killed. And then you live in this larger society that keeps pushing pro-life, anti-abortion. And then you look at how many women and children, have been murdered by that same, society. It's just, there's so much trauma, so much, all different kinds of trauma that we live with. And, it's a lot. It's like other people say, it's a lot of emotion to carry. There's just, we get so much from so many different directions, and it's a little overwhelming and it is emotional, and I'm just trying my best to bring the positivity out of what I can and figure out what we can do so that we can keep the culture we have and keep helping people relearn it. And maybe you guys have better words for what I was trying to think of earlier for, like, what do we call that privilege of looking the stereotype of Native? I feel almost like cringy, like saying those, or I don't know how to describe that. Maybe you guys have better stuff for that.
Well, I've definitely experienced what you're talking about, and like with job placement and opportunities when they want you to speak, and it'll probably feel gross to many of you hearing this, but I've actually even had people say, "Don't touch your hair." The donors and the sponsors are going to want to see your hair. Or don't put blonde highlights in it. Like just giving you that directive of don't change your appearance, um, because we'll benefit from it. It wasn't about my benefit, and I'm dying to get my hair done. And it's just kind of those instances that we have to encounter. But then too, I have a light skinned child, like he has blonde hair. He's very translucent. He looks just like his dad. He looks exactly like his sisters. And then I have one very dark one. And it's hard to believe that they're so different in color, but they're exactly alike. They talk alike, their mannerisms, they're exactly alike. They smell alike. And having to be a parent to say your life is going to be very different than your life, and even being a parent to a child who experiences discrimination in the education in the public school system. And it's hard as a parent and as a society member, and then also to have to put the didactics onto the wall, to rewrite the narratives for us, um, is that it's hard to face all this, but then I also have very fair complected cousins who do the same job. And they also have to say, you know, it's very hard as a quarter blood, or it's hard as a half breed. And, you know, we use these words among ourselves as Indian people. And a lot of times some people do get offended. And it's not, and I've even gotten in trouble for um, quoting one of our elders among our family. But it's very hard to have to face that and then have to teach about it, and then try to move past it. But it's also really, I guess today's change, you know, our electoral power, hopefully that will ease some of those hurdles that we have in having to have that conversation. So I just want, there is no easy word is what I guess I'm trying to say. And maybe one of somebody else could help guide us in how to um generate these words into what we need to say, or even how we write it, because that's going to be the lasting document that we leave, our written words, not just spoken, but what we leave behind.
I wanted to say mahalo to everyone for sharing your thoughts about what we might call blood quantum and appearance. That definitely has filtered over into the Kanaka Maoli or Native Hawaiian community as well. And there's consistent sort of negotiation with how we move forward and relate to each other about something as our appearance. Because customarily, we didn't have blood quantum. And to this day, genealogy is paramount. So that genealogy is seen as something that's expansive. So if, you know, your children could be whatever blood quantum, they're still Hawaiian. That didn't disconnect them from our kupuna, from our ancestors. I know for certain state and federal programs, there are blood quantums, and that was something that's been continuously contested and negotiated. And historically, you know, it's just caused more division than, you know, healing. So at least for us, a lot of that work in terms of healing and coming to terms with that has been relying on sort of the way that genealogy can be expansive, and that genealogy can connect us in different ways. And that genealogy doesn't just connect us as Hawaiians to each other, but as I look out into the rest of the Pacific, those kinship relations, that genealogy connects me to other places in the Pacific as well. And so that when I go to do work and connect with other people, whether they be in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or in Palau, I'm meeting them as another Indigenous specific person. So it becomes a refreshing way to sort of maybe get away from how the US tries to treat me and tries to treat us, you know, in a way that is consistently insisting in our disappearance, you know, as, you know, folks have said here, signified by the something else vote. So as one of the something else's, I say hello to all the other something else's on the screen. But I wanted to pick up a thread about sort of this moment and sort of thinking of the next generation. I know that at least here in Hawaii, there are a lot of Kanaka youth who voted for the first time and who have been active since Mauna Kea. And there was sort of a sense of like, at least at the state and local level, like of a, oh shit moment. Because the election didn't quite go the way we wanted to in terms of our local elections and who got voted in. And so in thinking of moving forward and electoral power, I would say that my role and the role of other activists who are my age or older has been sort of to say, hey, don't worry, we're in this moment, but we still organize and we still insist on accountability of our elected officials. And so it means that we do what we've always done, which is we show up to give testimony. We show up to, push people who are appointed and people who are elected to make the decisions that reflect the community and to reflect the land, because oftentimes Hawaiians are the only ones who are speaking for the land itself. We're the ones who are saying it's unacceptable that you're bombing our lands. It's unacceptable that development runs amok without any check in terms of how to make community better. So I would say that we can look to the example of our relations in the Pacific particularly. So I think of 350.org, Pacific Climate Warriors, and the new generation of activists who are there. They give me great hope because they remind us that we're not, sitting down and lying down when it comes to climate change. We're taking action. And we make the connections with people who understand that Indigenous people are the core of the resistance when it comes to climate change. So a lot of, I think, what we end up doing in this moment is just reminding the younger generation, like, hey, it is a long struggle. It's as John Lewis said, wait, was it John Lewis? John Lewis said, make good trouble. I think I've also heard the phrase, the beautiful struggle, that we continue with those things. So the moment is that we have some victories and some kind of half-hearted things that have happened in terms particularly of local politics, but we keep mobilizing, we keep moving forward. But we take a moment to take a breath and to be like, now that the Mandarin Mussolini will be ejected from the White House, we don't have to put so much of our head space and oxygen with that, So we take a breath, we regather, we recommit, and we move forward.
Thank you. Tani, would you like to have anything to share?
No.
We'll come back to you. No problem, no problem. I just want to always make sure I hear from certain people who we haven't heard as much from, even though they've contributed in beautiful ways. So what I'm going to do next is maybe transition into like the last question, if that's okay for people. And again, I'm going to briefly summarize it. So one of the things I asked on the previous panels for the election were a lot about like just the very important leadership roles that Native women and Native Two-Spirits, queer and trans folk have assumed in leadership, and not just like public visible leadership, but a lot of the caretaking roles behind the scenes, a lot of the mentoring work, a lot of the community care work, a lot of the emotional labor of sustaining our communities and like being there for each other is often been held by a lot of folk in sort of disproportionate ways at times. And so sort of wondering, who can we sort of talk about, as we're doing this movement work, how do people caretake the caretakers? How do people think about sustainable leadership? How do we think about creating communities as we're moving forward that really center Native womanist leadership, that really center Two-Spirit and queer trans Native folk, and that also sort of finds like models where everyone can share in that sort of collective communal caretaking, so that's not disproportionately a gendered form of labor that only some take on, and that have to do a second and third shift and a fourth shift of like doing all the work in addition to all the other work you do, where some people might be pursuing more of an individualist kind of career or something. So how can we like kind of create mechanisms for community support long term? So any part of that people might want to respond to, I would love to hear from you.
I want to give a shout out to my dear friend, Devin Emery, who is a nurse and a performer and a dancer and a choreographer here in New York City, as an example of someone who, and it also works as a hospice nurse. And so they are, have been dealing sort of both theoretically, but also in an embodied way with how we care for each other in moments of crisis, such as COVID and colonialism and violence against women and so many other things all at the same time. And Devin is a brilliant performer and someone who I look up to about these types of things. And so art and the arts, I think, have a lot to tell us, particularly people who are connecting art to community care. Joshua Pether is another person in Australia who is also working at this intersection of healthcare and art. And I think there are a lot of people who are doing that type of work who we can look to for guidance in terms of like how we bring our ancestral knowledge to bear on a moment that really requires deep feeling, deep caring, and deep community construction that can have the longevity while also attending to the immediate needs of like food, housing, safety, those types of things. Because it's, you know, it like we know that this is much longer term than one election, right? Like this is also why like I love the term town destroyer for the president that, you know, lots of, you know, Mohawks use. It's like, for me, like whatever, you know, like one president or another president, they're still the town destroyer, right? Like they're still not going to have our best interests at heart. And so we can breathe slightly, a slight sense of relief, but you know, in the ongoing decolonial resistance that is centering our ways of knowing and our ways of loving and our ways of positioning ourselves as good relatives, meaning to our kin networks and also to the animal and other than human and spiritual realms, right? Like that's how we have always done. That's the enactment of care, right? Like that's why decolonialism is good for Native people, but it's also good for all the people, because it means that the environment is less polluted, that there's like less capitalist exploitation, that there's, you know, a better sense of community care and ongoing reciprocity. All of that is beneficial for everyone, right? Like that's where I think we, you know, there are lessons to be drawn from those practices, and which we can also put into conversation in going forward and in broader terms.
Thank you. Would other people like to respond? I think also one of the things like that I think is important at this moment, and I'll let people have a moment to gather their thoughts, is I've heard from a lot of people who have been spending a lot of time with people who have been really very anxious and very depressed the past many days because they weren't sure where the vote would be going. And also they were hoping for a much more immediate and resounding victory on the night of the election, and that they were really hoping that it would be just a very clear done deal, that there would be a definite Senate majority win, a definite House, even though it looks like we'll be retaining the House and like, you know, winning the presidency. And there's definitely the chance again with those runoff elections. And also there's possibility of even Alaska with the Senate race still, because there's so many votes still to be counted, most of whom are mail-in ballots. So we'll be finding out more about that in the next week. And who knows, they're still counting in North Carolina, you never know. So in terms of the Senate races. So that said, and also there's opportunities in midterm elections and other things. But I think the reason why I want to bring up is like how people have been feeling is I think it's very important that we also talk with our communities, both those folk who might be politically aligned with us, but also those who may not think they're politically aligned, even though there's usually so much commonality and we can find middle ground. Because I think a lot of people think that this is maybe a failure, that even if it's winning, it's not a big enough win. And I think we have to like really not allow that sort of co-optation of this historic moment occur, because this is the largest number of people who have ever voted. You know, this is a tremendous mobilization. And we also have to see these victories in the context of vastly intensified gerrymandering, vastly intensified voter suppression, intimidation, violence, voter rolls being purged, people being asked for multiple forms of ID, like in Florida and in other places where there was wanting to have voter reenfranchisement of people who've completed their term in incarceration as former felons. That actually Floridians had voted a few years ago to help reenfranchise their voting rights. But then various state legislatures tried to undermine that and to institute like new kinds of poll taxes. And so like there's various ways in which the impressive work that has been done we have to look at the tremendously oppressive context in which it occurred. So for example, just in one example, Milwaukee, that during the primary should have had 180 polling sites was reduced to 5. And if during that primary election, when Milwaukee residents had 5 polling sites and were in line for hours and hours and hours, and that was very intentional, that suppression was very intentional, that they were still able to win a victory at their state Supreme Court level and get a Democrat up into that and replace a Republican. Similarly here, even if the people wanted to see maybe much more major victories, we have to look at in this context of tremendous suppression and people receiving like threatening calls, people who are counting the ballots being doxxed right now. I heard that story of someone like literally having to go into hiding because they're counting ballots and their public identity and home address was revealed. You know, so when we look at this virulent oppression and this, you know, this kind of trying to call the entire election into doubt that's been going on for months, I think it's really important that we talk with our communities about what has been done and what can continue to be done, and to not let our story be stolen, whatever that story is, however we're telling it. So I just wanted to mention that, and then I'd love to hear, you know, maybe from some other people, and whether it's about this around how to take care of ourselves at this moment, or maybe just other final thoughts that you might want to share about you reflecting on this historical moment, or things maybe you haven't had a chance to say today.
I think for me, you know, I lean heavily on my spirituality, and that's what keeps me grounded. But I have to admit that a couple of days ago, I said to my partner, I said, you know, I'm really scared. I'm really frightened. I'm frightened that if it goes to the red side, that we'll have 4 more years of, you know, this dictatorship, and a lot of damage can be done. I said, but I'm also frightened that if it goes to the blue side, I would be afraid to walk down the street. Because here in Vermont, you know, they used to have camps that trained clans people. And we still have, you know, pockets of that mindset in the state. And anyone who is not white in appearance can be targeted. And there are going to be people out there who are really, really angry that didn't go their way, and believe that they're justified. You know, you already hear people saying, you know, they're stealing the vote, they're stealing the election from us, like it was something that belonged to them. And you know, the anger that is behind that, you don't know how it's going to be projected, or you know, what punching bag they're going to use. And so it makes me frightened. It makes me frightened for my brothers and sisters I know that live in cities. You know, I live 45 minutes out of town. And, you know, I live up on a mountain where there's nobody. You know, you're talking about being in New York and hearing pans bang and everything. All I hear are the birds. You know, it's quiet and peaceful, and I hear the stream. And, you know, and that in itself is, you know, a privilege. I give thanks every day that I get to live here. But, you know, yes, the election went the way I hoped that it would go for, you know, for that main seat. But there's still a lot out there that needs to be dealt with. And, you know, there's still profiling that goes on. If a woman of color disappears, you hear nothing about it. But if a white woman disappears, it's on the front page, and it makes great news. You know, and those inequalities that happen are things that, you know, I think about and think about, you know, needing to be addressed, needing to be brought to the forefront. And the only way that I know how to do that is to talk about them, and to, you know, every opportunity I get a chance to share it with someone. Because you never know when you say something, how it's going to be received or how it's going to affect someone. You know, you might say an innocent comment and it can change another person's life and you'll never know it. And so, you know, educating, making myself aware, educating myself as to what's going on. And for me, it's all across Indian country. Yes, Standing Rock was, you know, a really big thing. But from Standing Rock, there are all these other actions that occurred. People trying to protect their land and pipelines. You know, it was just like Standing Rock was a quiet pond where somebody threw a rock in it and all the concentric circles went out. And that's still going on, but you don't hear about it in the paper. You know, you might hear about it in the native news, but it's word of mouth that you hear about it. You know, so it's not that I have a lot of friends on Facebook. They're my newsline. They're my newspaper. So, you know, it's and I trust what they say over any newspaper, because the newspapers are owned by our government. So, you know, that's what I see going forward, and you know, and how I'm feeling, you know, right at the moment. And I think that taking care of myself is going to require a whole lot more sitting by the stream and praying. And I'm not going to walk down the street alone. I'm going to take my granddaughter. She's strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly. That's powerful. Would love to hear maybe final thoughts from the other panelists.
I wanted to, first of all, Beverly, thank you for sharing that. And you're reminding me that even though I haven't been able to go home to New England to visit my family for a while, so it's good to hear you talking about it, and to remind me of those connections to Massachusetts, but I also have family in Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut as well. Ahimsa, thank you for pointing out and reminding us that this was the largest voter turnout. I think they're saying at least in the last 100 years. You know, and yes, in the face of such great suppression, violence, threats of violence, actual violence, thinking about moving forward, sometimes I'm thinking, you know, have we set up the mutual aid and support for folks like Stacey Abrams? You know, have we put in the time to, yeah, really take the moment to, you know, continue the fight, but offer that care. It makes me think about our activists and our community organizers here in Hawaii. Trying to think about that it can be really hard to incorporate that work. And I've heard other activists say that, you know, like, you know, we know that we need to keep fighting, but it can be really difficult to take a moment to step back, to allow someone who's been on the front lines to breathe, to pray, to have a good meal, to have a sense of not having complete amounts of stress bear down on them. I was privileged yesterday to take part in a internal work presentation focusing on Native Hawaiian stories. And we had an outside speaker come in, Dr. Alkahi Austin Seabury, who's trained as a psychologist, Native Hawaiian psychologist, who brings together traditional and customary knowledge with Western practice. And she said something that stuck with me, which is, it's okay to remind our friends who are on the front lines to sit down with you. Ideally, it would be in a situation like, hey, let's check your blood pressure. You know, let's take a moment to make sure you're hydrated, because it can be really hard to do that when the immediacy of the moment is just pressing down. So I think that supporting that type of work in those dialogues and those communications and that hand-holding is a way to move forward, you know, to make sure that, you know, we don't burn out our communities in the effort to mobilize and to be active. And within my day job in health insurance, I get some flexibility to try to support that as well. But thank you everyone for sharing your own thoughts and your own mana'o, as we say here, about this moment and the ongoing historical, colonial, occupational traumas and healing and strategies for the future.
Thank you, Kaylee. Tani, Joseph, do you have any closing words?
You want to go, Joseph, or me?
No, you go ahead.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I don't know what my closing and parting words are because I don't like to disconnect. And we're always to be continued. And you know, I guess real quick, I want to share my, I guess, the point of resiliency in voting. Being from Oklahoma, I moved back to Oklahoma in 2017. From New England. We were Connecticut residents. I went to grad school in Massachusetts. And then before that, I was a undergrad in New Mexico. So I've kind of been all over the place. And among those times, I had a difficult time voting, but always figured out how to get an absentee ballot. But and don't hurt me for saying this. Um, I was on the Republican Party. I was a Romney supporter back long time ago, long time McCain, a long time ago. But that being said, because at the time the party was very supportive of our Native rights for religious purpose and hunting rights and so forth. So that was my point of view at that time. But since then, I feel, in my opinion, Oklahoma has made it very difficult going out of their way to make it hard to jump parties. And then because you have to do it on a certain year between a certain time period. And being an out of state absentee voter was very hard, even just to get a ballot sent to wherever I live, to have to prove residency. And if it's for education, you know, being from New England, being in Cambridge, how your residency changes because rent changes. You know, you're jumping from one pad to the next, and trying to establish the residency was really hard. And so from, I want to say, um 2000, I can't remember the year that Obama was elected, but in that period all the way till this year, it took me that long to get off the Republican Party in the state of Oklahoma. And so I was forced to vote straight party in the primary. And I wasn't happy, along with many other people at the voting poll. And we're told, well, if you don't vote straight party, then you can't vote in the election. And so that was my determination of having to keep writing to the election commission and keep saying, I want to switch parties. I'm a purple voter. I've been a purple voter for 3 elections now. I want to change my representation. And so that's my own personal feat in getting to vote in this election. But then also my husband too, who'd never voted before. Our son had never voted before. He became 18 at this time. And so and then the importance, again, back to our children, our little kids who said, "Mommy, did you vote?" You know, making sure they were keeping me under pressure to vote. So that's my personal story of resiliency, and the closing parting words that, um, as minute as it might have been, I feel I contributed. Thank you.
And I would just say that one gesture, final gesture of solidarity would be to keep organizing with our Black and Latinx comrades. And so I wanted to say, in Cherokee language, we learned how to say Black Lives Matter. And in Cherokee, that is Anigunage da nu nu uskatiyu. So that's what I would like to end with today.
Thank you all so much. Like, it's been really beautiful, powerful gathering with each of you. I want to thank Tani Aton, Harjo Growing Thunder. I want to thank Kristen Gentry, Alison Herrera, Beverly Little Thunder, DK Lee McKenzie, Joseph M. Pierce, and also Vince Chrysostom, who has been doing organizing all day today in a variety of ways and couldn't actually join us physically, but sent his best. And I want to thank again the American Community House and Tulsa Arts Fellowship for making this possible. And I guess my closing words would be, yeah, just to think about different ways that we can not only remain politically active, like one of the things, because I was checking with my family members to make sure who all was, I just assumed everyone was registered, and then I was surprised and shocked that some people weren't. And I was like, you're 29. What do you mean you haven't been registered for 11 years? How did this happen? And so I think this can now be like a birthday party thing, where you bring the 18-year-old who is now an adult, but you're interacting with as a child. You're like, here, we're taking you to voter registration. It's a big day, it's beautiful. So not just prior to elections, but literally how to like have things be a part of it. And for that person, you know, to maybe on the next small little election, seemingly small, to be a part of it and just to become a part of it. Because the more we're voting in those small elections, the last chance we'll get purged from the voter roll as being inactive. And to maybe just periodically, almost like a health self-exam, check to make sure you're still enrolled, people. Just check to make sure that they haven't pushed you off, and find other ways of, you know, engaging in these conversations. And I think the last thing I'd say would be, in terms of taking care of ourselves and showing up for each other, is to think about the ways in which not only we're oppressed but privileged, and to think about the ways in which, you know, for those folk who are light-skinned, showing up for those folk who are more medium complected or darker skinned, and making sure we're centering people in the work that we do. Are we supporting the women in our lives? Are we supporting the Two-Spirit and queer trans people in our lives? I know various people who are unenrolled who make it a priority to prioritize the enrolled people in their communities as an act of solidarity for people who have lived within their tribal centers. And I think there was other loving perspectives tonight. I know that's something that people have prioritized. And also like to be thinking about not just phenotypically in terms of various people were talking about lighter skin folk, but for our red black loved ones, for various people who are mixed with multiple communities of color, Asian and Native, multiple indigenous communities from outside the US and Native North American, who are also sometimes like not assumed to be Native in a variety of ways, and to fight that anti-Black racism and all the other forms of oppression that result in these erasures. So I'm thinking about the ways we can show up for each other and lovingly support each other, and not just politically, publicly, but behind the scenes, and to really see like, what are ways I can support this Haudenosaunee woman's leadership within this organization? What is the way I can show up, maybe do the work of labor organizing, but I don't have to be up at the mic in this moment. This is a time to focus on and prioritize other folk at this moment. That's something that I've been in conversation with a lot of people about is, and various text messages are coming in, so I didn't turn that off. Yeah, just different ways that we can lovingly show up for each other, and also to check in with those folk who have been pulling all-nighters doing organizing, who maybe like myself, I pulled 2 all-nighters in the past week and a half and was pulling 3 hours of sleep on the nights I slept. So for those who've been doing especially heavy lifting, like what are the things that those people need? Do they need a home cooked meal dropped off at their front door? Do they just need a phone call to check in? Who are the people who are really geographically isolated or technologically isolated? And how can we reach out to our loved ones that maybe we haven't had a chance to reach out to them recently? And just to make sure, they know that they're loved, and that we're here for each other. So I just want to say I love you all and thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you at other AICH programming in the future, also other programming with the Tulsa Artist Fellowship. And please check out these wonderful people who've gathered with us over the 3 sessions. And yeah, keep mobilizing. We love you. Be blessed.